The rain hit the windshield in uneven waves as Malcolm Avery Brooks sat outside the Fulton County Courthouse staring at the manila envelope on the passenger seat. Vanessa's attorney had clipped a fluorescent yellow sticky note to the top page. Final property execution. The words looked temporary. Casual, even. But the line beneath them wasn't. Vacate premises within 72 hours. Malcolm kept one hand on the steering wheel while downtown Atlanta glowed through the storm ahead of him, glass towers blurred behind streaks of water. Across the parking lot, he watched Vanessa laughing beneath the courthouse awning beside a tall man in a charcoal coat holding a black umbrella over her head. She hadn't noticed Malcolm still sitting there. Or maybe she had. Either way, she never looked back. If you're listening from somewhere tonight, drop your city in the comments. I always wonder how far these stories travel. Malcolm folded the paperwork carefully instead of crumpling it. That was the first thing people misunderstood about him. Quiet never meant weak. It meant controlled. Even now, with the marriage officially dissolved less than 40 minutes earlier, his breathing stayed steady. No dramatic phone calls. No shouting in courthouse hallways. No scene. He adjusted the heat inside the aging Lexus SUV and looked once more toward the courthouse entrance. Vanessa leaned closer to the man beside her as they crossed the wet sidewalk toward a black Range Rover waiting at the curb. The driver stepped out to open the rear passenger door. Malcolm noticed details automatically. The umbrella wasn't hotel-issued. Custom handle. Expensive leather gloves. Temporary Georgia tag on the Range Rover. Recently leased or recently transferred. The man touched Vanessa's lower back possessively before helping her inside. Small movement. Familiar movement. Not new. Malcolm started the engine only after the SUV disappeared into traffic. The house smelled unfamiliar when he walked inside later that evening. Vanilla candles burned near the staircase even though Vanessa used to complain artificial scents gave her headaches. Fresh flowers sat on the kitchen island. White orchids. He stood in silence for a moment, water dripping from his jacket onto hardwood floors he had refinished himself 6 years earlier. The television in the den played softly in the background though nobody was watching it. Camille sat curled at the far end of the couch scrolling through her phone, oversized college sweatshirt pulled over her knees. 17 years old and suddenly careful with her words around both parents. She looked up briefly when Malcolm entered. Mom said movers are coming Saturday, she said quietly. Not accusatory. Not emotional. Just rehearsed. Malcolm nodded once. You eat yet? Earlier. She hesitated before adding, Mom's upstairs. Malcolm set his keys beside the ceramic bowl near the doorway and noticed another unfamiliar detail. 3 garment bags hanging along the dining room wall. Designer labels visible through clear plastic covers. Vanessa had been spending more lately. More dinners downtown. More networking events. More weekends where her phone stayed face down. He never confronted her because accusations without complete information felt reckless to him. But patterns mattered. And lately, patterns had started overlapping in ways he couldn't ignore. Upstairs, the bedroom closet stood half empty. Vanessa moved through drawers with efficient detachment, folding silk blouses into luggage cubes while an instrumental jazz playlist drifted softly from her phone speaker on the dresser. The calmness bothered him more than anger would have. She looked like someone preparing for a business trip instead of dismantling 12 years of marriage. The renovation team starts Monday, she said without looking at him. I figured it's easier if the house is empty before then. Malcolm loosened his wet tie slowly. Renovation team. Kitchen. Upstairs bathrooms. Flooring. She zipped another suitcase. The contractors needed a clean timeline. Malcolm leaned lightly against the doorframe. Contractors. Timelines. She spoke about the house like ownership had emotionally transferred long before court finalized anything. His eyes drifted toward a binder sitting open on the bed beside her purse. Paint samples clipped inside. Architectural sketches. Estimated completion dates. Some pages were time-stamped nearly 4 months earlier. 4 months before she officially filed. Vanessa noticed where he was looking and calmly closed the binder. "I didn't want to wait around forever, Malcolm." The sentence landed softly. Which somehow made it worse. Downstairs, Malcolm opened the refrigerator and stared absently at untouched groceries while rain tapped steadily against the kitchen windows. He wasn't hungry. Mostly he was thinking about timing. About systems. Vanessa's promotion last spring. The sudden separate accounts. The new attorney she claimed a coworker recommended. Even the court settlement had moved unusually fast once proceedings started. Too clean. Too coordinated. His phone buzzed against the counter. Jordan Ellis. Malcolm stared at the name for a moment before answering. He hadn't spoken to his former mentor in almost a year. "You all right?" Jordan asked immediately. Malcolm glanced toward the staircase. Vanessa's footsteps moved faintly overhead. "Been better." "Listen carefully," Jordan said, voice lower now. "You still have access to your old joint operating account?" Malcolm frowned slightly. "The household account?" "No," Jordan replied. "The Merrill account tied to your consulting distributions." Malcolm straightened slowly. Rain hammered harder outside. "Why?" There was a pause on the other end. Not hesitation. Calculation. "Because somebody's been moving money through shell transfers connected to your old LLC." Malcolm said nothing. His eyes moved toward the dark hallway leading to the garage where packed cardboard boxes already waited beside the door. Jordan continued quietly, "And Malcolm, these transfers started almost a year before Vanessa filed." The kitchen suddenly felt colder than it had a moment earlier. Malcolm looked toward the ceiling where muted footsteps crossed the bedroom floor above him. Slow. Familiar. Domestic. But for the first time in 12 years, the sounds no longer felt connected to the life he thought he understood. And standing there beneath the dim kitchen lights, listening to rain strike the windows of a house he no longer legally owned, Malcolm realized the divorce might not have been the real story at all. Calvin barely slept after Paula's reaction. The sentence kept replaying in his head with mechanical precision, as if his mind refused to let it blur. Maybe this is finally the wake-up call you needed. No panic. No fear. No questions about Jordan. Just that cold, strangely prepared calm. By Wednesday night, the house itself felt different to him. Not hostile. Worse. Organized. Intentional. He stood alone in the kitchen rinsing dishes while rain tapped softly against the windows above the sink. Upstairs, Paula's footsteps crossed the bedroom floor in slow measured patterns, then stopped completely. A moment later, her phone vibrated. Not rang. Vibrated. Calvin looked up instinctively. Silence followed. Then the bedroom door clicked almost shut. Not all the way. Never all the way. Just enough. He dried his hands carefully and glanced toward the staircase. Her voice was too low to make out words, but once again he caught the same tone he'd noticed for weeks now. Soft. Controlled. Different from the distracted sharpness she used with him lately. The kind of voice people reserved for someone they were trying not to lose. He stood there listening to the muffled rhythm of a conversation he was apparently no longer important enough to hear. Jordan wandered into the kitchen rubbing his eyes. Mom leaving again tomorrow? Calvin looked down at him. Why would you ask that? Jordan shrugged and opened the refrigerator. I heard her talking about flights. Calvin's hand stopped against the counter for half a second. Flights? Yeah. Last night. Jordan grabbed a juice box. She said Friday works better because you'll be home. The refrigerator light spilled across the kitchen tiles while something cold settled quietly into Calvin's chest. Paula had told him she had an all-day leadership conference downtown Friday. No travel. No overnight stay. He kept his expression neutral as Jordan shuffled back toward the stairs. "Get back to bed, buddy." But long after Jordan disappeared upstairs, Calvin remained motionless beside the sink, staring at the rain sliding down the dark glass. "Friday works better because you'll be home." The wording bothered him more than the lie itself. As if his presence at the house mattered strategically now. The next morning, Calvin arrived at work earlier than usual. The operations floor was still mostly dark except for emergency lights glowing over empty cubicles. He sat alone in his office staring at spreadsheets he wasn't really reading. At 7:18 a.m., his phone buzzed with a fraud alert from their joint credit card. A luxury hotel charge pending authorization. The Langford Crescent Hotel. Downtown Charlotte. 2-night reservation. Calvin leaned back slowly in his chair. The amount itself wasn't what caught him. It was the timing. The reservation had been made at 6:52 that morning, less than an hour after Paula left the house. He clicked into the transaction details again, jaw tightening almost invisibly. Executive suite. Valet package included. He remembered Paula criticizing him 2 months ago for buying Jordan a $70 science kit because money was getting tight. Outside his office window, employees began filtering into the building carrying coffee cups and laptop bags. Normal life continued around him while the shape of his own marriage shifted into something unrecognizable. Calvin opened a blank email draft and typed the hotel name into the search bar instead. Corporate luxury. Private elevators. High-profile business clientele. The kind of place people chose when discretion mattered more than cost. At lunch, Paula texted him for the first time all day. "Running non-stop today. Don't wait up tonight." No heart emoji. No explanation. Just information delivered like a calendar update. Calvin stared at the message while sitting alone in his truck beneath the parking garage lights. Then another thought surfaced quietly behind everything else. Paula had never once asked how he planned to support the family after losing his job. Not once. No budgeting conversation. No fear about the mortgage. No discussion about insurance. It was as if she already knew those problems wouldn't matter much longer. That realization followed him home that evening like a second shadow. The house was empty except for Jordan upstairs playing video games. Paula's car was gone. Calvin loosened his tie slowly and noticed something sitting near the hallway table beside her discarded mail. A white envelope partially hidden beneath a fashion magazine. Thick paper. Legal-sized. His name wasn't on it. But the return address in the corner made his pulse slow instantly. Harrington and Blythe Family Law Associates. Calvin stared at the envelope for a long moment without touching it. Then his eyes drifted lower to the handwritten appointment note visible through the partially open flap. Friday. 2:30 p.m. Initial asset review. And beneath that, in smaller writing, one phrase that changed the entire scale of what he thought was happening inside his marriage. Bring all account transfer documentation. Calvin did not touch the envelope right away. He stood in the hallway with the kitchen lights dim behind him and the legal firm's name staring back at him like something alive. Harrington and Blythe. Family Law. Asset Review. The words settled heavily into place beside the hotel reservation, the secret calls, the strange emotional detachment that had spread through Paula over the last month like slow-moving frost. Upstairs, Jordan laughed faintly at something through his headset, completely unaware that the foundation beneath his life might already be shifting. Calvin finally slid the envelope partially open with careful fingers. Inside were printed financial worksheets. Sections highlighted in yellow. Joint checking. Retirement projections. Mortgage balance. His consulting income estimates. The numbers weren't random. Someone had spent time preparing this. Detailed time. Deliberate time. His eyes stopped on one line near the bottom of the page. Expected employment instability may strengthen temporary support positioning. Calvin stared at the sentence without moving. She had already factored his job loss into legal strategy less than 4 days after he told her. The realization didn't hit like anger. It landed colder than that. Organized. Efficient. Like discovering someone had quietly begun dismantling his life while still sitting across from him at dinner every night. He heard headlights outside moments before Paula's car pulled into the driveway. Calvin slid every paper back exactly as he found it, aligning the edges carefully before stepping into the kitchen. When Paula entered through the garage door, she looked tired but strangely lighter than she had in weeks. Her cream-colored coat smelled faintly of expensive perfume and rainwater. "You're still up?" she asked casually, setting her purse on the counter. Calvin nodded once. "Couldn't sleep." She opened the refrigerator without looking at him. "Long day." Then her phone lit up against the marble countertop. A message preview appeared for less than a second before she flipped the screen over. But Calvin saw enough. Friday confirmed. He suspects nothing. The kitchen suddenly felt very small. Paula noticed his eyes shift toward the phone, and for the first time in weeks, actual tension crossed her face. Tiny. Fast. But real. "Work stuff," she said immediately. "Too quickly." Calvin simply nodded and reached for his coffee mug. "Right. If you were in Calvin's position right now, would you confront her immediately or keep watching quietly a little longer?" Paula exhaled slowly, studying him for an extra second before turning away. That hesitation bothered him more than the text itself. She was measuring him now. Calculating what he noticed. Later that night, Calvin lay awake beside her while rain pressed softly against the bedroom windows. Paula's breathing remained uneven, not asleep yet. Around 12:43 a.m., her phone vibrated once beneath her pillow. She shifted carefully, thinking he was asleep, then slipped out of bed with silent movements that felt practiced. Calvin waited exactly 10 seconds before following quietly into the hallway. Downstairs, only the under-cabinet kitchen lights were on, casting pale gold shadows across the floor. Paula stood near the back window with her back turned, voice barely above a whisper. "No, he actually believed it," she said softly. A pause. "I know. Friday changes everything." Calvin remained perfectly still near the staircase landing, one hand resting against the wall. Every instinct told him to walk into that kitchen. To force the truth into the open. But something deeper stopped him. The same instinct that had kept him alive professionally for 15 years, managing crises before they exploded. Observe first. Move second. Paula laughed quietly at something the other person said. Not warmly. Nervously. "Just make sure the documents are ready before the meeting," she whispered. Documents. Meeting. The language wasn't emotional anymore. It sounded procedural. Structured. Almost corporate. Calvin stepped silently back upstairs before she could turn around. His pulse stayed controlled, but his mind had already begun rearranging pieces into something far uglier than an affair. This wasn't spontaneous betrayal. It had infrastructure. The next afternoon, Calvin left work early under the excuse of a migraine. Rain clouds hung low over downtown Charlotte as he parked across from the Langford Crescent Hotel. Luxury black SUVs lined the entrance beneath the awning while valets moved through the drizzle with umbrellas raised over wealthy guests. At 2:27 p.m., Paula emerged from a rideshare wearing the navy dress she normally reserved for executive dinners. Calvin watched through the rain-speckled windshield as she entered the hotel lobby without hesitation. Not nervous. Familiar. 10 minutes later, another man walked through the revolving doors carrying a slim leather portfolio under his arm. Mid-50s. Silver watch. Dark umbrella. Calvin recognized him instantly from the framed partner photos on Harrington and Blythe's website. Senior divorce attorney Michael Renner. But what made Calvin's stomach finally tighten wasn't seeing Paula meet the lawyer. It was watching the hotel concierge greet her by name before escorting both of them toward the private elevator corridor like this was something that had already happened before. Calvin stayed in his truck across from the Langford Crescent long after Paula and Michael Renner disappeared into the private elevator corridor. Rain streaked slowly down the windshield, blurring the gold hotel lights into soft distorted lines. He replayed the concierge's greeting in his mind. Not polite surprise. Recognition. Familiarity. The kind reserved for repeat guests. By the time Paula returned nearly 2 hours later, Calvin had already stopped thinking about this as a possible affair alone. Affairs were emotional. Chaotic. This felt organized. Structured. She exited the elevator composed and unhurried, carrying a slim black folder she hadn't arrived with. Renner walked beside her speaking quietly while she nodded once, professionally, almost like colleagues finishing a meeting. Neither touched each other. Somehow that unsettled Calvin more. Intimacy could be irrational. This looked strategic. Calvin waited until they separated before pulling away from the curb. His hand stayed steady on the wheel, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. For weeks he had been reacting emotionally to disconnected clues. Now patterns were beginning to lock together. The fake sympathy after he claimed he lost his job. The legal worksheets. The hidden calls. Friday changes everything. It was no longer suspicion searching for meaning. It was a system revealing its outline piece by piece. That night, Paula returned home carrying takeout containers from a restaurant downtown she knew Calvin disliked because of the prices. Client dinner ran late, she said casually while setting her keys down. Calvin noticed the black folder was gone. During dinner, she spoke more warmly than she had in weeks. Asked Jordan about school. Smiled twice at Calvin. Even touched his wrist briefly while passing him a plate. The sudden softness felt rehearsed enough to make his stomach tighten. He watched her carefully across the table, realizing her behavior now shifted depending on what role benefited her in that moment. Cold distance when she thought he was weak. Controlled warmth when she needed stability maintained. Jordan laughed about something from science class while Paula nodded attentively, but Calvin noticed her checking the microwave clock every few minutes like she was waiting for a specific time. At exactly 8:15, her phone buzzed once against the counter. She glanced at it instantly. Reflexive. Conditioned. Then she stood. I need to answer one quick work call. Work call. Again. Same phrasing every time. Same measured tone. Calvin listened to her footsteps disappear upstairs while quietly opening the family iPad sitting near the living room charger. Paula used it occasionally for online shopping. Most notifications synced automatically. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for anymore. Maybe confirmation. Maybe proof that he wasn't imagining the growing architecture around him. The device unlocked immediately. Calendar app still open. His eyes moved across upcoming entries until one repeated appointment stopped him cold. Our consultation. Every Thursday. 6 months straight. Always during hours Paula claimed she was at leadership workshops or networking dinners. Calvin scrolled further. Several entries had attachments removed, but one older appointment still contained a PDF thumbnail that hadn't fully deleted from cache. He opened it carefully. Harrington and Blythe Family Asset Positioning Checklist. His chest tightened slowly as he scanned highlighted sections. Mortgage restructuring options. Temporary custody recommendations. Recommended timing after employment destabilization. One sentence near the bottom sat heavier than all the others. Maintain normal domestic presentation until financial vulnerability phase is confirmed. Calvin stared at the screen while the house around him remained perfectly ordinary. Jordan upstairs. Dishwasher humming softly. Rain tapping against the windows. Meanwhile, his marriage had apparently become a timed procedural operation months before he even realized something was wrong. He closed the file immediately when he heard Paula's footsteps returning. "Everything okay?" she asked from the hallway. Calvin looked up calmly from the couch. "Yeah. Just checking emails." She studied him for 1 second too long before smiling faintly and heading back toward the kitchen. Calvin noticed something else then. Tiny. But impossible to ignore now that he was truly looking. Paula no longer wore her wedding ring consistently inside the house. He had missed it before because she still wore it publicly. Photos. Events. Dinner with friends. But at home, during private moments, the ring increasingly disappeared. As if the marriage only needed to exist performatively now. Around midnight, after Paula fell asleep, Calvin quietly walked downstairs and opened the locked filing drawer in his home office where he kept tax returns and mortgage paperwork. 20 minutes later, surrounded by silent pools of monitor light and untouched coffee gone cold beside him, he found the first financial inconsistency big enough to make him sit back in complete silence. 3 separate transfers from their joint savings over the last 8 months. Small enough individually to avoid attention. Consistent enough together to reveal intention. Each routed into an LLC he didn't recognize. Crescent Holdings Group. Calvin opened another browser tab and searched the business registration records. The filing address appeared instantly on the screen. Langford Crescent Hotel Corporate Suites. Registered 7 months ago. Managing Representative, Michael Renner. Calvin sat alone in his home office until nearly 3 in the morning, the glow from his monitor reflecting faintly across stacks of tax folders and untouched coffee gone cold beside his elbow. Crescent Holdings Group. Registered 7 months ago. Managed by Michael Renner. Funded partially through carefully staggered transfers from Calvin and Paula's joint savings. He opened every monthly statement side by side across dual monitors, scanning transaction patterns with the same disciplined precision that had made him successful in operations management. The transfers never happened randomly. They appeared within 48 hours of specific events. His fake job loss. Paula's executive promotion. Their mortgage refinance consultation. Even Jordan's private school tuition renewal. Each movement seemed connected to timing rather than money itself. Structured. Layered. As if someone had built an operational timeline around the collapse of his marriage long before he ever suspected it was happening. At 3:17 a.m., Calvin noticed another detail buried inside an insurance statement. An emergency contact update submitted electronically 4 months earlier. Paula had removed him entirely from her executive life insurance paperwork and replaced him with someone named Andrea Vale. Calvin frowned slightly. The name sounded familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. He searched his email archive and found it less than 2 minutes later. Andrea Vale. Senior HR Compliance Director at Paula's company. The same woman Paula constantly described as, basically family, after years of late-night leadership retreats and executive conferences. Calvin leaned back slowly in his chair. Family. The word carried a different weight now. By Friday afternoon, the world around him had begun revealing hidden structures everywhere he looked. At work, Calvin casually mentioned to a colleague that he might need recommendations for temporary consulting if the layoff became permanent. The reaction unsettled him immediately. Not sympathy. Recognition. "I heard about that weeks ago," the man said carefully near the break room coffee machine. Calvin kept his expression neutral. "Heard what?" The colleague hesitated. "Nothing official. Just. Paula's company has been talking about restructuring spouses and relocation packages around executive promotions. I assumed you guys already knew." Calvin nodded once and thanked him casually before walking away, but the words stayed with him all afternoon. Weeks ago. His fake firing had happened days ago. Somehow conversations about his instability were already circulating socially before the lie even existed. That realization followed him into the parking garage later that evening, where he sat inside his truck watching rainwater collect beneath fluorescent lights. He began mentally reconstructing the last year with new eyes. Paula encouraging him to scale back consulting hours, to focus more on family. Paula insisting their assets become easier to streamline under joint digital management. Paula pushing him to handle more childcare and household responsibilities while she expanded socially through executive circles he was rarely invited into anymore. One isolated decision could be normal. A year of coordinated positioning was something else entirely. Saturday night brought another shift in the pattern. Paula hosted a small dinner gathering at their house for 3 people from her executive team. Calvin cooked because that was what everyone expected him to do now. Quiet husband. Reliable support system. Invisible infrastructure. He moved between the kitchen and dining room carrying plates while conversations flowed around him in polished corporate rhythms. Promotions. Mergers. Leadership optics. But midway through dessert, Calvin noticed something that made his pulse slow dangerously. Michael Renner's name surfaced casually in conversation. Andrea says Renner handled the transition perfectly, one executive laughed while sipping wine. Honestly, he's basically part of the executive onboarding strategy at this point. Paula reacted instantly. Tiny. Almost imperceptible. Her wine glass paused halfway to her lips before she smiled too quickly and redirected the subject. But the damage was already done. Calvin remained silent while clearing plates, though his mind had already locked onto the phrase. Executive onboarding strategy. Not divorce attorney. Strategy. As if Renner operated inside some larger internal system connected to promotions, relocations, and asset restructuring. Around 11:40 p.m., after the guests finally left, Calvin carried empty wine glasses toward the kitchen when he heard Paula speaking softly near the mudroom hallway. He stopped automatically when he recognized Andrea Vale's voice through Paula's phone speaker. "You need to move faster now," Andrea whispered. "If he starts asking the wrong questions before Renner finalizes the exposure review, this gets messy for everybody." Everybody. Calvin stood motionless in the darkened hallway while the dishwasher hummed quietly nearby. Exposure review. Not settlement. Not divorce preparation. Exposure. The word settled into him differently. Corporate. Legal. Strategic. Paula lowered her voice further, but Calvin caught one final sentence before the call ended. "We've invested too much time in this to let him complicate it now." Calvin remained perfectly still long after the line disconnected. Then slowly, very slowly, he looked toward the family photos lining the hallway wall. Vacations. Birthdays. Christmas mornings. 12 years of memories arranged beneath warm lighting while an entirely separate structure had apparently been operating quietly underneath his marriage for months. Maybe longer. But the detail that finally made the entire situation feel truly dangerous came an hour later when Calvin reopened the Crescent Holdings registration records one last time before bed and noticed an attached corporate filing he had overlooked earlier. Additional advisory board members. 3 names listed beneath Michael Renner. Andrea Vale. Paula Reeves. And Calvin's own regional director at the logistics firm where he had supposedly just been laid off. Calvin did not sleep at all after seeing his regional director's name attached to Crescent Holdings. He sat alone in the darkness of his home office while the digital clock rolled past 4 a.m., the entire house silent except for the low hum of the air vents. The revelation changed the geometry of everything. Until now, he had believed Paula and the others were building a legal advantage around his supposed financial instability. But his boss being connected to the structure meant the instability itself might not be accidental. Calvin opened months of archived company emails and performance reports, searching not emotionally but methodically. Patterns emerged almost immediately. Key projects reassigned away from him without explanation. Executive meetings cancelled after Paula's promotion cycle accelerated. Consulting reductions encouraged internally at the exact same time Paula pushed him to prioritize family. Even the restructuring rumors now looked less like corporate necessity and more like positioning. Someone had been slowly narrowing his visibility, income leverage, and professional mobility long before he ever claimed to lose his job. The realization landed with a terrifying kind of calm. They had not reacted to weakness. They had been engineering it. If you've ever realized people around you were quietly shaping your life without you seeing it at first, you already know how disturbing that moment feels. By sunrise, Calvin had stopped viewing himself as a husband discovering betrayal. He was beginning to feel like the only person in the room who still didn't fully understand the operation happening around him. At breakfast, Paula moved through the kitchen with unusual ease, humming softly while packing Jordan's lunch. The warmth in her voice had returned completely now, but Calvin understood something different about it. Her calm no longer reassured him. It suggested confidence. The kind people have when they believe outcomes are already secured. You should take some time before looking for another position, she said lightly while pouring coffee. Maybe reset a little. Calvin looked at her carefully over the rim of his mug. Reset. Another word that sounded harmless until placed beside legal positioning checklists and hidden financial structures. Maybe, he answered evenly. Paula smiled faintly and kissed Jordan on the forehead before checking her phone again. Calvin noticed she never left the device unattended anymore. Not even for seconds. Later that afternoon, Calvin drove downtown under the excuse of meeting an old colleague. Instead, he parked 2 blocks from Harrington and Blythe and watched the building from inside his truck. Rain moved steadily across the city streets while executives and attorneys filtered through the lobby beneath polished marble lighting. At 2:12 p.m., Andrea Vale exited a black SUV and entered the building without checking in at reception. Familiar access. 10 minutes later, Calvin's regional director arrived separately carrying a leather document case. Neither looked nervous. Neither behaved like people hiding an affair or casual misconduct. They moved with the confidence of individuals participating in something institutional. Structured. Calvin's eyes narrowed slightly as a new possibility formed. This wasn't just about divorce leverage. It looked closer to coordinated asset positioning tied to executive advancement and controlled reputational risk. And somehow, he had become the liability inside the structure. He remained parked across the street for nearly an hour until another detail quietly shifted everything again. Paula arrived through the private underground entrance accompanied by hotel security staff from the Langford Crescent. Security staff. Not assistants. Not colleagues. One man handed her an envelope before escorting her toward a restricted elevator corridor inaccessible from the public lobby. Calvin watched carefully through rain-streaked glass while something colder settled into place inside him. Whatever meetings were happening inside that building carried enough sensitivity to involve controlled access movement between legal offices and private hotel facilities. The scale was growing faster now. That evening, Calvin quietly reopened old financial archives stored on an external hard drive in his office closet. Tax returns. Mortgage records. Investment summaries. At first glance everything appeared normal. Then he found a sequence of authorization forms buried inside digital refinancing paperwork from 18 months earlier. Paula had added conditional access permissions tied to executive incapacity clauses and temporary financial management authority. The forms required dual legal review signatures. One belonged to Michael Renner. The second signature stopped Calvin cold. Andrea Vale. HR Compliance Director. Why would an HR executive need legal authorization authority connected to his household financial structure? Calvin sat back slowly, eyes fixed on the screen while late-night city lights spilled faintly through the office windows. Then another detail surfaced beneath the authorization metadata. The documents had not been initiated by Paula. They originated from a consulting entity attached to Crescent Holdings. Filing category: executive spousal transition planning. Calvin read the phrase 3 times in complete silence. Spousal transition planning. Like this was not an isolated betrayal at all, but a repeatable system. A managed process. His pulse stayed controlled, but his breathing slowed dangerously as the implications expanded outward in his mind. How many executives had used this structure before? How many spouses had been quietly weakened, repositioned, financially isolated, then removed under the appearance of normal marital collapse? And most importantly, why had Paula's company invested this level of coordination into him specifically? Calvin stared at the final attachment timestamp buried at the bottom of the file. Initial assessment opened 22 months ago. Nearly a full year before Paula's behavior ever started changing. Calvin closed the laptop slowly and sat motionless in the dim light of his office while the phrase continued echoing in his mind. Executive spousal transition planning. Not emotional betrayal. Not even ordinary divorce strategy. A system. Refined enough to have categories, authorization protocols, legal structures, and corporate coordination extending across executives, attorneys, HR leadership, and financial positioning firms. 22 months. They had started building this around him nearly 2 years ago while he was still helping Jordan with homework at the kitchen table and cooking dinner every night, believing his marriage was simply going through strain. The realization should have shattered him. Instead, something colder happened. The confusion finally disappeared. For the first time in months, Calvin understood the shape of the battlefield clearly enough to stop reacting emotionally to it. And once that happened, his silence became something different entirely. The next morning, Paula watched him carefully across breakfast. Calvin noticed it immediately now, the subtle monitoring hidden beneath her softened voice and supportive expressions. "You seem better today," she said while stirring coffee. He nodded faintly. "Just trying to stay realistic." The answer visibly relaxed her. Calvin almost felt the shift happen in real time. Weakness reassured them. Confusion reassured them. The version of him they believed they were managing depended completely on him remaining emotionally behind the curve. So Calvin leaned into it. He let his shoulders stay slightly tired. Let his voice remain subdued. When Paula mentioned another networking dinner Thursday night, he simply smiled faintly and asked if she'd be home before Jordan went to bed. No suspicion. No resistance. Paula touched his hand gently across the counter. "You've been handling all of this really well." Calvin looked down at her hand resting against his and realized she genuinely believed he still knew almost nothing. By afternoon, he had already started quietly repositioning himself. Not dramatically. Small moves. Controlled ones. He contacted an old college friend named Marcus Bell under the pretense of catching up over lunch. Marcus now specialized in corporate compliance litigation for a private risk advisory firm in Atlanta. Calvin never mentioned Paula directly. He simply described the structure hypothetically. HR involvement in marital asset positioning. Executive-linked legal coordination. Controlled employment destabilization tied to family leverage. Marcus stopped eating halfway through the conversation and stared at him carefully across the restaurant table. "That's not standard divorce behavior," he said quietly. "That sounds closer to executive risk containment." Calvin kept his face neutral. "Meaning?" Marcus lowered his voice slightly. "High-level companies sometimes isolate liabilities before promotions, mergers, political appointments, acquisitions. Affairs. Addiction. Financial instability. Anything that threatens optics or compensation structures. But if legal firms and HR are coordinating personal asset transitions together," he paused. "That's deeper than reputation management." Calvin nodded once without reacting outwardly, though internally another piece slid into place. Liability. That was how the system viewed him now. Not husband. Not father. Not partner. Liability. That evening, Calvin drove alone through uptown Charlotte after everyone fell asleep. Rain reflected across glass towers and empty intersections while black SUVs moved silently beneath corporate high-rises glowing long after midnight. He parked across from Paula's office building and watched executives filter out through secured garage entrances. At 11:26 p.m., Andrea Vail emerged with two men Calvin recognized from corporate strategy photos on the company website. All three entered a private town car together while reviewing printed folders beneath the parking structure lights. One folder carried the same Crescent Holdings insignia Calvin had already seen buried in legal paperwork. They weren't hiding anymore because they didn't believe anyone understood enough to see the pattern. That confidence was becoming their blind spot. Back home, Calvin quietly opened an old fireproof lockbox hidden behind archived tax documents in his office closet. Inside sat something he had not touched in nearly 5 years. Original partnership agreements from an infrastructure software startup he helped build during his early logistics career before taking the operations director role. He had never discussed the investment much because it had remained dormant for years after acquisition restructuring. But as Calvin reviewed the documents beneath the soft desk lamp glow, his eyes narrowed slightly. The company had not disappeared. It had evolved through layered holding groups and silent acquisitions into something significantly larger. Much larger. And according to the newest quarterly statement still arriving privately through trust distribution channels, Calvin still retained full beneficiary ownership through a blind equity structure worth more money than Paula had likely ever imagined he possessed. He sat back slowly, untouched bourbon glass beside him catching reflections from the monitor light. For the first time since this nightmare began, the balance inside the room shifted. Not emotionally. Structurally. Because suddenly Calvin understood something none of them appeared to know yet. The man they had spent 22 months strategically weakening, was never actually financially vulnerable to begin with. But the detail that truly changed everything came seconds later when Calvin opened the final attachment inside the trust packet and found a confidential acquisition memo dated 11 months earlier. Acquiring advisory partner under consideration, Harrington and Blythe Family Law Associates. Parent acquisition entity, Winterfield Strategic Holdings. And directly beneath the corporate seal sat the name of the majority silent shareholder overseeing final approval authority. Calvin Reeves. Calvin reread the acquisition memo 3 times beneath the low amber glow of his office lamp while the rest of the house slept upstairs. Winterfield Strategic Holdings. Majority silent shareholder, Calvin Reeves. For years, the trust structure had existed quietly in the background of his life, handled through layered investment managers and legacy acquisition boards after the original software company evolved beyond anything he personally managed day to day. His grandfather had taught him early that real ownership was often invisible by design. If people can measure your value quickly, the old man used to say, they'll build strategies around what they think they can take. Calvin had almost forgotten those words over the years spent living modestly, raising Jordan, managing operations, cooking dinners, building an ordinary-looking life. But now, sitting alone while rain tapped softly against the dark windows, he understood something almost surreal. The legal firm coordinating his destruction technically operated beneath a holding structure he partially controlled. And nobody inside the system appeared to know it yet. The next several days became an exercise in restraint. Calvin changed nothing outwardly. That was the first strategic decision he made consciously. At breakfast, he still looked tired. Still thanked Paula for coffee. Still asked Jordan about school projects while Paula moved through the kitchen carrying herself with the calm confidence of someone approaching a finished outcome. But Calvin watched differently now. He noticed how often she checked for emotional reactions from him. How carefully she monitored his energy, his optimism, even his posture after work. Weakness remained part of the profile they expected him to occupy. So he maintained it carefully, almost like camouflage. Thursday evening, Paula hosted another executive dinner downtown and left wearing a black dress Calvin had bought her 6 years earlier before one of her first leadership promotions. "Don't wait up," she said lightly while fastening an earring near the hallway mirror. Calvin nodded from the couch without looking up from Jordan's science homework. The performance satisfied her immediately. She smiled faintly before leaving, never realizing Calvin had already memorized the name of the private dining room reserved under Crescent Holdings earlier that afternoon. An hour later, Calvin sat inside a black town car moving silently through uptown Charlotte beneath reflections of rain and city lights. Marcus Bell had arranged the meeting quietly through a private contact. No emails. No digital scheduling trail. The vehicle stopped beneath the underground entrance of a glass tower Calvin technically owned equity in without most people ever realizing it. Upstairs, inside a silent boardroom overlooking the city skyline, an older woman named Evelyn Mercer slid a thin folder across the polished table toward him. Chief Oversight Counsel for Winterfield Strategic Holdings. She had known Calvin's grandfather personally. "You've been difficult to locate through the trust channels," she said calmly. Calvin opened the folder without speaking. Inside sat internal acquisition summaries, oversight memos, executive exposure reports, and something else far more important. Harrington and Blythe had not finalized integration into Winterfield yet. The acquisition remained pending majority shareholder approval. His approval. Evelyn folded her hands carefully across the table. Based on these internal ethics concerns, she said quietly, the board delayed final execution months ago. Calvin's eyes narrowed slightly as he continued reading. Crescent Holdings was already under confidential review for unauthorized strategic family interventions tied to executive liability shielding. Meaning someone inside the system had already suspected abuse before Calvin ever uncovered it himself. "Does anyone know I'm connected to Winterfield?" he asked finally. Evelyn shook her head once. "Your grandfather designed the ownership structure specifically to prevent visibility. Publicly, you're several layers removed through beneficiary trusts." Calvin leaned back slowly, untouched bourbon sitting near his elbow while the implications settled into place. For nearly 2 years, Paula and the others had been Bill. Calvin left Winterfield's tower just before midnight with the confidential participant file sealed inside a plain black portfolio case that looked intentionally forgettable. Rain drifted softly across the empty Charlotte streets while black SUVs moved beneath the city lights like silent shadows between glass towers. 26 months. Paula had entered the system half a year before her behavior toward him changed. That detail stayed with him more than anything else. It meant the emotional distance, the subtle humiliation, the strategic isolation at home and professionally had never evolved naturally. It had been phased in deliberately. Structured. Taught. By the time Calvin reached home, Paula was asleep upstairs, her phone charging beside the bed. He stood quietly in the doorway watching her for a long moment, realizing something difficult and strangely freeing at the same time. The woman lying there no longer understood the man she thought she had already defeated. The next week unfolded like controlled theater. Paula grew visibly more confident now that Calvin had fully embraced the role they expected from him. He spoke less at dinner. Mentioned applying for lower-level consulting contracts. Even allowed his frustration to surface carefully once when discussing money near Jordan's school tuition paperwork. Paula's reaction came instantly. Calm reassurance. Soft concern. The exact emotional management style someone would use on a person they believed was becoming dependent and destabilized. "We'll figure things out," she told him gently while touching his arm across the kitchen island. Calvin nodded quietly, almost ashamed looking, and watched relief settle behind her eyes. Weak men made predictable targets. Predictable targets made systems feel safe. If you were watching this unfold from the outside right now, would you think Paula realizes how badly she's misreading him? Or do you think she still believes she's completely in control? Thursday evening brought another escalation. Paula invited Calvin to attend her company's executive recognition gala at the Langford Crescent Hotel. "You should come," she said while adjusting an earring in the hallway mirror. "People keep asking where you've been." Calvin almost smiled at the wording. Social optics mattered now. Public appearances mattered. Which meant whatever final phase they were approaching likely depended on maintaining a carefully managed narrative around him. He agreed immediately. That seemed to surprise her. The ballroom shimmered beneath gold chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-lit skyline. Executives moved between private tables carrying crystal glasses and polished smiles while a jazz quartet played softly near the stage. Calvin wore the same navy suit he'd owned for years. Deliberately understated. Paula, meanwhile, moved through the room with the polished confidence of someone already ascending socially into another life. Calvin noticed the subtle changes immediately. People spoke around him instead of to him. Conversations shifted when he approached. Several executives gave him carefully measured sympathy smiles usually reserved for men already considered professionally finished. He understood then that the narrative about his collapse had circulated far wider than he originally realized. But the most revealing moment came near the center bar when Michael Renner approached holding a bourbon glass. "Calvin," he said warmly, as though greeting an old friend. "Paula's told us you've had a difficult few months." Calvin accepted the handshake calmly. Transitions happen. Renner studied him for half a second longer than necessary, almost evaluating whether the conditioning had fully taken hold yet. "Well," he said smoothly, "sometimes letting go of old structures creates room for healthier futures." Calvin met his eyes evenly. "Depends who built the structure in the first place." For the briefest instant, something flickered behind Renner's expression. By Monday morning, the pressure inside the system had become visible even to people who didn't understand what they were looking at. Paula barely touched breakfast. Her phone vibrated constantly against the marble countertop while she answered messages with clipped précis. Calvin stood alone in the dark executive corridor for several seconds after the voices inside the boardroom fell silent again. The emergency authorization envelope rested inside his jacket pocket like something alive. Through the glass walls behind him, rain drifted across the Charlotte skyline while the city continued glowing beneath the illusion that everything above it remained stable. Inside the ballroom downstairs, Paula and the others still believed they controlled timing, narrative, exposure, outcome. That assumption was the only thing still protecting them. Calvin turned calmly and walked back toward the elevators without making a sound. By the time he re-entered the gala floor, the music had resumed, waiters moved between tables carrying champagne, and executives laughed beneath chandeliers completely unaware that an internal collapse had already begun upstairs. Paula spotted him immediately near the reception bar. "There you are," she said softly, relief flickering behind her eyes. "I was starting to wonder where you disappeared to." Calvin gave a tired smile. "Needed air." She studied him carefully for signs of suspicion, panic, instability. Instead she found exactly what the system expected to find. Quiet exhaustion. Emotional defeat. The role he had performed so well for them. Her shoulders relaxed almost instantly. That small reaction told Calvin everything. They still had no idea who was actually holding leverage now. 23 minutes later, the first crack appeared publicly. Michael Renner stepped onto the ballroom stage beside several Winterfield acquisition representatives to begin what guests assumed was a routine partnership announcement tied to executive restructuring initiatives. The atmosphere shifted subtly as attorneys, executives, and corporate board members gathered closer beneath the stage lighting. Paula stood near the front beside Andrea Vail, wine glass in hand, calm and composed. Calvin remained farther back near the rear marble columns where security staff could still see him clearly. Renner adjusted his microphone. "Before tonight's final acquisition review proceeds," he began smoothly, "Winterfield Strategic Holdings requested several internal compliance clarifications related to Crescent Holdings' operational practices." Andrea's expression changed first. Tiny. Sharp. Not fear yet. Recognition. Renner continued speaking, but Calvin noticed something important immediately. He was improvising now. The controlled confidence from earlier had vanished beneath carefully managed tension. A second later, 3 additional Winterfield oversight attorneys entered through the side ballroom doors carrying sealed black document cases. Guests nearby began whispering softly as the energy in the room shifted from celebration to uncertainty. Paula slowly lowered her wine glass. Then came the first real impact. One of the oversight attorneys approached Renner directly on stage and handed him a sealed compliance suspension notice in front of the entire ballroom. Renner read the first page silently. The color drained almost imperceptibly from his face. Calvin watched the moment happen with complete stillness. Not triumph. Recognition. The exact second a man realizes the structure protecting him may no longer exist. Andrea moved toward the stage immediately, but another attorney intercepted her halfway there. "Ms. Vale," the woman said professionally, "we need you to remain available pending internal review." Around the ballroom, conversations died almost completely now. Executives exchanged confused glances. Security staff repositioned quietly near exits. Paula turned slowly through the crowd searching for Michael Renner, but Renner no longer looked at her. He was staring down at the suspension documents in visible disbelief. Calvin noticed his hands trembling slightly for the first time all night. Then Paula saw Calvin standing near the back of the room. And something inside her expression shifted instantly. Not understanding yet. But instinct. The kind that tells people the environment around them has changed in ways they don't fully comprehend. She crossed the ballroom quickly toward him, heels sharp against marble floors. "What's happening?" she asked quietly once she reached him. Her voice remained controlled, but barely. Calvin looked toward the stage where Winterfield Council had now fully interrupted the acquisition presentation. "Looks like compliance issues," he answered calmly. Paula stared at him harder now. "You knew something about this?" Calvin met her eyes evenly. "Should I?" For the first time since this entire nightmare began, Paula had no immediate read on him. No emotional map. No predictable weakness to manage. Just stillness. Dangerous stillness. Across the ballroom, more phones began lighting up simultaneously. Executives checking emails. Legal notifications. Emergency review memos. Calvin recognized the sequence instantly because he had authorized it himself less than 40 minutes earlier from the executive corridor upstairs. Full Crescent Holdings asset freeze pending internal fiduciary investigation. Every connected financial structure was now locking down in real time. Andrea's phone slipped slightly in her hand while reading the notification. Michael Renner stopped speaking altogether midway through an explanation. One of the Winterfield attorneys quietly requested security escort him upstairs for immediate review. And then the second shockwave hit. A compliance officer approached Paula directly in front of half the ballroom and handed her a sealed participant notice marked Confidential Acquisition Exposure Review. Calvin watched her open it with visibly shaking fingers. Her eyes moved across the first paragraph once. Then again slower. The blood drained from her face completely. Finally, very slowly, she lifted her eyes toward Calvin standing only a few feet away. Because printed near the center of the document beneath the Emergency Oversight Authorization Code was the name of the majority silent shareholder who had initiated the entire investigation against Crescent Holdings. Calvin Reeves. For several seconds after reading the document, Paula simply stood there in the middle of the ballroom unable to move. Around her, conversations had collapsed into stunned whispers while Winterfield attorneys crossed the marble floor carrying sealed files between security personnel and executive oversight staff. The chandeliers still glowed overhead. Waiters still moved uncertainly between untouched wine glasses and abandoned dessert plates. But the atmosphere inside the Langford Crescent had changed completely. Prestige had turned into exposure. Calvin watched Paula's eyes move back to the document again, then slowly rise toward him with something he had not seen from her in nearly 2 years. Fear. Real fear. "You," she whispered, barely audible now. "You're connected to Winterfield." Calvin held her gaze calmly. "Looks like I've been more connected than either of us realized." The answer wasn't cruel. That somehow made it worse. Because there was no anger left in him now. Only clarity. Across the ballroom, Michael Renner was being escorted toward the executive elevators by 2 internal compliance officers while 3 separate Winterfield attorneys reviewed acquisition files directly on stage under full view of the remaining guests. Andrea Vale's composure had fully cracked. She stood near the side corridor speaking urgently into her phone before another oversight representative quietly informed her that all external communication devices now fell under temporary preservation review pending investigation. Her face drained instantly. Nearby executives began creating physical distance from anyone associated with Crescent Holdings. Calvin noticed the social shift happen almost in real time. People who had smiled confidently beside Paula an hour earlier now avoided eye contact entirely. Nobody wanted proximity to a collapsing structure once legal exposure entered the room. Paula looked around slowly as the reality finally began settling into place. The system she trusted was not protecting her anymore. It was protecting itself. "Calvin," she said quietly, stepping closer. "I didn't know about all of this." Calvin studied her face carefully beneath the ballroom lights. For the first time since this began, she looked genuinely disoriented. Not manipulative. Not polished. Lost. But another realization sat heavier inside him than any anger could. 26 months. She may not have understood every layer of the structure, but she had still stepped into it willingly long before she started dismantling their marriage piece by piece. "You knew enough," he answered softly. Paula flinched almost invisibly at the calmness in his voice. That hurt her more than shouting would have. Moments later, the second wave of collapse arrived publicly. Winterfield Oversight Council announced immediate suspension of all Crescent Holdings executive transition operations pending fiduciary investigation and participant review. The wording echoed sharply through the ballroom microphones while guests stood frozen beneath the chandeliers. Then came the financial notices. Emergency asset preservation orders. Acquisition freeze directives. Internal compensation holds. Every executive connected to the transition structures began receiving notifications simultaneously across glowing phone screens throughout the room. Calvin watched panic spread quietly through expensive suits and controlled smiles. People weren't just afraid of scandal now. They were realizing their money, positions, and legal protections might already be unraveling in real time. Paula's own phone buzzed repeatedly in her trembling hand. Corporate access restricted. Executive review initiated. Compliance suspension pending interview. She stared at the screen without breathing for nearly 2 full seconds. Then her knees weakened slightly against the edge of a marble cocktail table. Calvin instinctively reached out to steady her before she lost balance completely. The gesture broke something in her emotionally. She looked up at him with tears finally forming in her eyes, not from humiliation alone but from the terrifying realization that the man she spent nearly 2 years quietly underestimating was now the only stable thing left in the room. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. Calvin's expression remained painfully calm. "You stopped wanting to know who I was a long time ago." Silence settled heavily between them while around the ballroom the entire hidden system continued collapsing outward. Attorneys moved quickly through side corridors. Security escorts appeared near executive exits. Several board members were already leaving through private elevators attempting to distance themselves before public exposure spread further. And still Calvin stood completely composed in the center of it all, the same quiet operations manager everyone had dismissed as emotionally dependent and financially vulnerable. Except now people were beginning to look at him differently. Carefully. The way people look at someone after realizing they completely misunderstood the balance of power in the room. Near the stage, Michael Renner suddenly stopped walking toward the elevators and turned back toward Calvin one final time. The attorney's face had gone pale beneath the ballroom lighting. "You could have ended this quietly," he said low enough that only Calvin could hear. Calvin met his eyes evenly. "You should have left my family out of your system." Renner held his stare for a long moment before security escorted him through the corridor doors and out of sight completely. Paula watched the exchange silently beside Calvin, and for the first time she fully understood something irreversible. This was never just about a marriage collapsing anymore. The entire machine behind it had targeted the wrong man. Then another Winterfield attorney approached Calvin directly in front of the remaining executives and handed him a final sealed authorization folder marked Emergency Board Succession Review. Paula saw the recognition ripple instantly across several faces nearby. Executives whispering. Board members staring. Security repositioning subtly around him now instead of around Crescent personnel. The power structure inside the room had already shifted. And somewhere deep beneath the humiliation, panic, and collapsing alliances around her, Paula finally realized the most devastating truth of all. Calvin had not merely survived what they built around him. He was now in a position to decide exactly who walked away from the wreckage, and who didn't. The rain had stopped by the time Calvin finally left the Langford Crescent. Dawn was beginning to soften the edges of the city skyline, pale gold light creeping slowly between the glass towers while black SUVs disappeared quietly into empty downtown streets. Behind him, the ballroom that had once felt untouchable now stood hollowed out by silence, legal teams, and collapsing reputations. Crescent Holdings operations had been frozen indefinitely before sunrise. Internal participant reviews were already spreading through executive channels. Michael Renner's law firm faced emergency fiduciary investigation. Andrea Vail had been placed under corporate suspension pending compliance inquiry. None of it happened loudly. No screaming. No dramatic arrests. Just power retracting itself from people who suddenly realized the system protecting them had stopped answering their calls. Calvin stood alone beneath the hotel awning for a moment, breathing cold morning air while city lights faded overhead. For the first time in nearly 2 years, his mind felt completely still. Paula found him outside 10 minutes later. She had removed her heels and carried them in one hand now, mascara faintly smudged beneath tired eyes. The confidence she once wore so effortlessly had disappeared somewhere upstairs between the compliance notices and the realization of who Calvin truly was. She stopped a few feet away without speaking at first. The silence between them no longer felt hostile. Just final. "I didn't understand what I was stepping into," she said quietly at last. Calvin looked out toward the waking city rather than at her. "You understood enough to let it keep happening." Paula lowered her eyes immediately. That was the part she could no longer escape. Not the corporate structure. Not Michael Renner. Not Crescent Holdings. Herself. The small decisions. The strategic coldness. The moments she chose ambition, comfort, or convenience over loyalty long before the system collapsed around her. Calvin finally turned toward her, calm and unreadable beneath the soft dawn light. "I would have given you everything honestly," he said quietly. "You didn't have to build a machine around me to take it." Paula's face broke at that sentence more than anything else from the entire night. Because deep down, she knew it was true. 3 weeks later, the divorce proceedings moved quietly through private legal channels instead of public courtrooms. Winterfield attorneys handled everything with surgical precision. The house remained protected under Calvin's trust structures. Jordan stayed with him full-time temporarily while Paula's executive review continued. Calvin never fought to destroy her financially even though everyone now understood he could have. That decision spread quietly through legal circles faster than the scandal itself. Restraint carried its own kind of power. Several former Crescent participants attempted private settlements once the investigations expanded. Others resigned before exposure reached shareholders. Michael Renner disappeared from public practice entirely pending ethics review. Andrea Vail's name vanished from corporate leadership directories within days. Systems built around manipulation collapsed strangely once people stopped believing they're untouchable. Calvin watched all of it happen from a distance inside the quiet order of his own life. Mornings with Jordan before school. Coffee on the back porch. Early sunlight across the yard he had built with his own hands years earlier when life still felt simple. One evening near the end of autumn, Paula came by the house to pick up Jordan after dinner. The marigolds near the fence had started fading with the season, but the yard still looked exactly the way Calvin remembered building it. Paula stood silently beside the porch steps for a long moment before speaking. "I used to think you were afraid to take up space," she admitted softly. Calvin leaned lightly against the porch railing, hands calm in his pockets. "No," he answered. "I just never needed everyone else to notice me to know who I was." Paula nodded slowly, eyes glistening as the full weight of that truth finally settled into her. The man she spent years underestimating had never been weak. He had simply been disciplined enough not to perform his power for other people. Jordan ran out the front door then, backpack bouncing against his shoulder while talking excitedly about a school project Calvin had helped him finish earlier that afternoon. Calvin smiled automatically watching his son climb into Paula's car. And in that moment, standing quietly beneath the porch light while the evening air carried the first hint of winter, he realized something unexpected. Winning had never really been about exposing Crescent Holdings or reclaiming financial control. It was about surviving the attempt to make him forget his own worth. Paula lingered beside the car door one final second before looking back at him. There were 1,000 things she probably wanted to say. Apologies. Regrets. Explanations. But some damage becomes too large for language once the truth fully arrives. So instead, she simply nodded once and drove away into the fading light with the consequences of her choices sitting silently beside her for the rest of her life. Calvin remained on the porch long after the taillights disappeared down the street. The neighborhood had gone still again, peaceful in a way it hadn't felt for months. Inside the house, his untouched coffee sat cooling near the kitchen counter beside Jordan's science project and a stack of quiet legal documents finally marked resolved. No applause. No revenge speech. Just silence. Honest silence. The kind Calvin had always trusted most. And as the last of the sunlight faded across the yard he built with his own hands, the man everyone once believed they could quietly erase finally stood alone in the life that was still entirely his. If this story stayed with you, comment what moment hit you the hardest, and subscribe for more stories about quiet people nobody should have underestimated.